We are delighted to be here this morning with Dr. Harriet Pattison, who, as I've said to her before, she's one of my favorite people in home ed land. Harriet's done a lot of research, but she's also a home educator, from when her children were younger, she was home educating. So she brings all of that experience and insight into her research, and her research was on how children learn to read. And I don't want to go into that too much because I'm sure she will, but that also sort of opened up a lot of things. So I think it can be extrapolated to lots of other areas and ways of learning. So I'm not going to say any more because this is really her field. So Harriet, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to spotlight you, even though you are screen sharing, so people can find where you are. And hopefully they can all see you now. So please go ahead, Harriet.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Juliet, and hello everybody, and thanks for coming along to this talk. It's really, really nice to be part of Learn Free. I think for about the 3rd or 4th year running, so it's great to be here, and thanks for coming along. So yeah, so like Juliet said, I'm Harriet Pattison. I'm an erstwhile home educator because our children have all grown up and gone on to do other things now, and left me just reflecting a lot on home education. Got 3 children, and they didn't go to school at all really until they got to sort of like 16, and they went off to college, and a couple of them went to 6th form. And so I had a long period of home educating and being at home with them, and a lot of time to think about and reflect on education and what was happening to them, and what that kind of meant, what we could extrapolate from that about learning and education in general. And so I want to talk through today some of the ideas that I've got about learning, some of the ideas that I've kind of gleaned and built up and worked on, beginning from that period of being at home and observing my own children learning. So I was lucky enough to meet up with Alan Thomas and work with Alan Thomas on a project on informal learning. And then I went on from there, as Juliet says, to do my own research around learning to read, which was learning to read in its entirety, but an awful lot of informal learning and understanding informal learning came into the Learning to Read project as well. And one of the things about looking at informal learning is that straight away, really, once you start thinking about informal learning, you come really quite hard nose up to some difficult questions. When we think about formal learning, we think about a situation, usually a classroom or a structured situation, and you've got a group of people, maybe school pupils, and a teacher or an adult or an expert who's going to give them some activities or talk to them about some particular things. And then at some stage later on in the process, there'll be a test, whether that's a formal test or an informal test, but whichever it is, it'll be taken as an indication of what they've learned or whether they've learned during that structured session. And everything feels very tangible. It feels like you can actually get hold of learning. You can see people coming in, knowing or not knowing certain things, and leaving, going out at the end, knowing more or being better at, and it all feels as if you can really get hold of it. Once you move into informal learning and you kind of take those parameters away, everything becomes much less certain. And Alan and I spent a lot of time just wondering what exactly it was that we were trying to pin down, without those kind of points of here's our learning objective, here's our learning situation, here's our test at the end to see what's happened. Without those points, what exactly was it that we were trying to get hold of? And in my thinking about it, I decided that actually that kind of thinking was the wrong kind of thinking. I was approaching the subject in the wrong way because I was looking for indications of those points in different sorts of settings and situations and just not finding them. And I decided that what I needed to do instead was to start trying to think about learning as an abstract concept, not as something that you could get hold of at all, but as something that was abstract and had to be understood in an abstract sort of way. So we know that our understanding of the world is full of abstract concepts, things like love and friendship and identity, very powerful things, very meaningful things, but things that we can't get hold of in a tangible way. We can't weigh them, we can't measure them, we can't look at them, we can't treat them in the way that we treat learning in a classroom. And I decided that I needed to think about learning in those same terms that I would think about love or friendship or identity, as being something that's abstract, not something that you can get hold of and measure. The next problem really is, how do we unpack those ideas of learning as an abstract concept? If we can't get hold of it in any kind of tangible, real, measurable way, how are we going to approach it, or how do we approach it? And one of the answers to that question, or one of those approaches that we could take, and that I got really involved and interested in, is our metaphorical understandings of learning, the way in which we approach learning through a series of metaphors that reifies the experience, makes that abstract process seem very real to us. Now, when I first start, there's some metaphor, hold on a second. I'm going to turn first of all to a definition of metaphors. So when I first started looking at metaphors, I was sort of the mind, I suppose, from my own school days, of thinking, well, metaphors are something that you use in English literature, and they're kind of literary artifacts that you use to make a description a little bit more interesting or atmospheric, or they're kind of something that a poet would use to bring certain ideas to life. But philosophers of metaphor argue that metaphors are actually much, much more important than that, that they underlie our thinking about the abstract concepts like love, like friendship, like identity, like learning. And our understanding of those things is caught up in metaphors. And if I go back here now, some of those things that we think about, the way in which we understand learning, are inherently metaphorical. So the idea that learning is gaining new knowledge, or that learning is a progression, or learning is adding to the things that you already know, or learning is getting better at things. Instead of understanding those as real processes, as tangible things that actually exist out there in the world, I started trying to think about those things as being signifiers of an abstract concept we don't really understand, but that we're trying to get at through those metaphorical ideas of what learning is. So I'll look at some of those now in a bit more detail and try and explain a bit more about what I mean by those. So one of our chief metaphorical ideas about learning is that learning is an acquisition, that to learn something means to get hold of something, something new that you didn't have before, that you're acquiring knowledge. And we talk about, you need to grasp these ideas, or I'll give you some help, as if the help is being actually literally handed over, is a giving of help. Or we say he's got the idea, he's got the basics, he's got those, he owns those, they're in his possession. Or even this idea that you'll get your head around it, that there's something's inside your head, something's going to move from outside your head to inside your head. You're literally going to have it in your head. And sometimes, when we feel that we're there, we say things like, I get it. So we're thinking about learning as acquiring something. And sometimes when we talk about these metaphors, they are so deeply imbued in us that you need to take a step back and think, actually, learning is not about having something. Understanding learning, a metaphorical way of understanding learning, is that we understand it as having something. But that's an understanding. That's not actually what learning is. We have no evidence to suggest that that's what learning is. Similarly, we often think about learning as building. We think that we start in a particular place with the foundations and that we build onto those foundations. I was interested in learning to read. One of the things that you hear over and over again in learning to read is that phonics are the building blocks of reading. Phonics are the building blocks of literacy. And we've got to get those building blocks. They're the foundation, get those in place. Then you can start building up to higher skills. And that picture of, of literally putting things in place and building them up, very powerful metaphors of what's going on in learning. Another one that we're really used to thinking about is the idea that learning's a journey. And, you know, say like today, we're thinking, oh, we're going to set out and explore our metaphorical understandings of learning. And that kind of idea that, you know, this is a progressive journey, that we're going to take it step by step, that we've come so far and we've got this far to go. Or, you know, if you're not really understanding things, we can say, I'm lost. I don't know where I'm going in all this. And then we can say, well, you know, don't worry, you'll get there, because there seems to be a destination. There's a point that we're all moving towards. And then one that I particularly take issue with, the idea of milestones, things like the UIFS, imbued with the idea that children need to meet milestones, and that idea of the journey, that metaphorical idea deeply embedded in our thinking about children's learning and development, that it is a journey, and that you know, the idea that you literally go past milestones that mark out that journey towards a destination that's a tangible destination in front of you. Another one that we talk a lot about, that's imbued in our thinking around learning, but is perhaps a bit less obvious than the ideas of building and journeys and progress, is that learning's a surface. And we talk about things like, well, we've covered a lot of ground, or we can go back over something, or we can stay on the subject. Let's stay on the subject. We're on our way now, or we've covered this area, so now we're going to move on to a different area. And again, it's a metaphor that's really deeply imbued in our thinking, something that we use subconsciously or unconsciously when we think about learning. So sometimes, of course, there are a couple of cartoons there of ideas that sometimes, you know, when we sort of put these ideas into a more kind of casual, sort of cartoony kind of thinking about them, about what is it that we're actually saying here. And sometimes that's the point at which people take issue with them. You know, the idea of filling up the bucket, or, you know, or throwing things at a dartboard and seeing what it is that sticks. But a lot of the times, I say, we're using them unconsciously. We're not thinking about them to the extent that they seem really natural to us. They seem, when you start talking about metaphors, I think initially, at least, it's very difficult to kind of get away from the idea, well, actually, I thought this was reality, and I thought the way that we talked about it reflected that reality, rather than this is the way that we understand an abstract concept, and we are imposing that narrative, that understanding onto something which may be out there, but which we can't grasp unless we have these forms of talking about it, these ways of thinking about it. I think one of the most powerful, one of the most powerful indications of how deep those metaphors go in our mind, how deep those understandings go, is this idea of the learning curve that we come across over and over again in almost all educational enterprises. Learning can be understood through this kind of really simple, really powerful diagram, that learning is a progressive journey, that you start off down there at the bottom on the left, and you go up and to the right. And that area under the white line, that's the area that you've covered. So those ideas about journey, about progress, about learning being covering things, covering a surface, all indicated in that really simple diagram that seems to encapsulate what learning is, but is actually a result of those metaphors, those embedded metaphors of understanding. And as I say, when I started doing the research, I had my own kind of struggles with, why doesn't this template fit onto what I'm seeing? Why can't I understand the informal learning that I'm looking at in home education? Why can't I understand it with these tools, with these metaphors, with this understanding? Because at least to start with me, these didn't seem like metaphors. They seemed like real things that actually happened, rather than ways of understanding things. So my big mind shift came with my reading research. Sorry, I'm just wondering where these sort of musical notes have come from. I don't know. My big mind shift really came when I started doing the reading research. Alan Thomas and I had a website at the time. We put out a call for participants. We got 311 responses, which covered 400 children, which still amazes me that we got that lovely big round number. There were 215 boys, 184 girls, and we had 2 adults who also answered the call for participants who'd been home educated themselves and were reflecting back on that home education for us. And we also got enormous diversity, which was absolutely great. We got home educators of all sorts of ilks, philosophical home educators, religious home educators, children who'd never been in school, children who'd come out of school. We got children mostly from the UK, but we also had respondents from the United States and from other parts of Europe. So we had a really mixed bag of participants, which was absolutely great, and I think added to the depth of the research. So reflecting on the things that parents told us, because we were asking parents to think about children's reading, apart from the 2 adult participants who were thinking about their own. We asked them questions about, what had happened to their children, what had happened in their families, and some very varied and different pictures of what it meant to learn to read started to emerge. And I started to experiment around some different ways of representing those stories. And this one here, this is the diagram that I drew to try and encapsulate those families where parents said there wasn't really a progress, nothing seemed to happen. All of a sudden, he could read, and I was particularly I was particularly personally interested in this because it happened to one of our children. She wasn't reading. I knew that she knew little bits and pieces. I knew that, she could recognize her name, and she liked looking at books, and, she would sort of sit and turn over the pages and tell herself a story and things like that. Or she'd ask me to read something for her, or occasionally she'd want to write something and she'd get me to write it out, and then, she would copy it. So I knew that she knew little bits and pieces, but those little bits and pieces didn't seem to add up to any particular kind of whole. And then one day she got given a book and she took the book away and read it. And there didn't seem to have been any antecedents that could explain why that happened. And I spent a long time thinking, I suppose at the back of my mind, I had that learning curve and I was trying to impose it onto the experience of watching our daughter just suddenly be able to read like that, and thinking, I must have missed something must have been going on and I missed it. How come I missed it? How did these things happen? Because I was very much thinking, and this has to be somehow a progression, this has to be a journey, even if it's just a very, very quick one. And then I heard these stories from other families who had experienced the same kind of things. And some of them talked about it in metaphorical terms quite differently. And they said, it was like a switch was thrown, or, a light bulb suddenly went on. And I started to think, maybe this isn't a journey. Maybe understanding this as a journey is the wrong metaphor. Maybe we need to be thinking about a change of states. Everything is there. And then suddenly, like the light bulb moment, the state changes. And what you saw in one way, in one moment, you see in a slightly different way the next moment. And it's not a journey at all. It needs a different kind of metaphor to explain it. So that was one of the new ways that I tried to think about what had happened, think about learning in terms of a different sort of metaphor. And I shouldn't have that one, sorry. This was another experience that parents talked about that seemed to reverse some of the ideas that that kind of learning curve and those metaphors that I was working with seemed to confound. And that was the idea of building, because we had a couple of parents who talked about the way in which their children had started reading in places quite different to the places that they had anticipated, who had, sorry, I've got a bar here that's obscuring, that's better. Sorry, back to this one. talking about learning not as building up, not as that idea of basics and moving on from basics, but of starting in a place that seemed to be an inherently difficult place to learn. So one mum talked about the way in which her son could read words like dinosaur and bungalow and exit and organic, and a list of really what would not seem to be beginner words at all. And she said he could do those before he could do the kind of the things that we think about easy in phonetic terms, things like mat and cat. And of course, that begs questions about, well, if we're talking about basics, is this a skill, a hierarchical skill in which there are clear basics, or do basics depend on something else? And one of the first things that most children learn to recognize in literary terms is their own names. And it's not that everybody who's called Sam learns to read their own name way faster than everybody who's called Alexandria. It's not that there is something inherently easy, it's that your own name, whether that's an easy phonetical name or whether that's a more complicated name, is meaningful. And it's the point of meaning that makes a word something to read either easy or difficult. And that in itself kind of confounds this idea that we're building, that there is an order to this and there are building blocks to this. Another trajectory that parents often talked about was they'd say the child started reading and then they'd make some progress and then they'd hit a point and then that progress would seem to tap off, or the child would lose interest, and they'd put the whole reading thing down and then they'd go back to it. Sometimes weeks later, sometimes months, some cases even years later, they would start reading again. And when they started reading again, when they picked up again, parents would comment on, well, it was at a different point, although they didn't appear to have done anything in that downtime. They would pick up at a different point that seemed more advanced. It seemed as if they had progressed without actually doing anything. And so I thought about this one as well. And to start off with, I thought, you know, that looks like the journey. It's just a journey with lots of breaks in it, or just a journey, you know, with some rests in it, but it's still got that sort of left to right upward going curve. And then I started to think again and think, actually, this could signify something really different. This could signify, instead of that kind of straightforward upward curve, this could signify a sort of movement up and down layers. And you could go, you could go up and then you could go down, you know, sort of like in a lift, stopping at different points. But there's no actual progress because you're just going up and down on this, you know, on this, I don't know, this kind of, I'm struggling to find a word that in itself is not a metaphor that messes up the vision by talking about a progress or a journey at this point. But something that goes up and down, not in a progressive kind of way, but because different things are meaningful or useful at different times. And that up and down is dictated by those and not by, you know, a point up there, which is the there that we're going to. So another one of these metaphors that really came up through the reading research as well was addressing the idea that learning is getting better at things. And again, the idea that learning is getting better, it's encapsulated in that learning curve and in our language and in the way that we talk about learning and in the way that we consider learning to have been successful, that learning is improving, you're getting better and better at things as you go on. And maybe in this idea that we're all lifelong learners now, you know, we have this kind of self-project that goes on way beyond formal education, all through our lives, that kind of project of improving ourselves and moving in this purposeful direction. And I was, again, some of the insights that came from parents made me stop and reconsider whether that's really what was happening in learning. And this mother here and the things that she said really set me off thinking about this. She talked about her son learning to read and saying that when he learned to read, or he felt, before he learned to read, he felt that doing that would close down part of his brain. He was a very imaginative boy, very into his imaginative play, and he wanted to hang on to that imaginative world. And he felt that somehow learning to read corrupted that world, or would corrupt that world, and change those things for him. So she said he didn't want to learn to read, he wanted to hang on to that world of his own for as long as he possibly could. And he did learn to read. He learned to read aged about 12 or 13. But the thing about that story is that it kind of breaks up the idea that we're continually improving, continually adding more, because what she's talking about there and what her son is feeling there are the losses that are entailed in learning something. Learning is not necessarily just about gaining things or just about getting better at things. It's also about losing things. And that came over really clearly in this example. But I started to think of it in terms of learning altogether, that when we say we've learned something, when we have kind of wedded ourselves to an idea or an understanding of something, that is also a selection process in which we have given away or given up on the idea that there are other ways of doing this, of understanding this, of knowing about this thing, because we are moving in one particular direction. And that for me put quite a different gloss on the idea of learning, quite a different. And some of those ideas I felt were better encapsulated, not in a learning curve, but in an idea of learning as being a movement, of moving around, of the metaphor that we needed to be one of movement and change, rather than one of progress, rather than one of left to right and down to up, and the area under the covered area of the things that we know, and no hint about the things that we might have given up, or the backwards and forwardness and the ideas of change that might surround all of this. The other thing that came out of the reading research that gave me real cause for reflecting on reading as a whole was some of the metaphors, some of the sort of spontaneous metaphors that parents themselves brought to all of this. And one of those that was really telling was the idea of literacy as a liquid. And sometimes parents talk spontaneously, things like we wash them in language, we grew up in a print-saturated environment, or the one at the bottom saying immersion in the real world, and the idea of learning as being not a solid, not those kind of building bricks of phonics, and not those kind of things that you could get hold of, but as a liquid. And I know, earlier when we looked at the sort of the cartoon impression of the filling of the bucket idea has got quite an entailment of that metaphor of acquisition, that we just fill learners up. But when we're filling them up with liquid, the liquid is a bit different to filling them up with the solid, because if you put a liquid into a container, the liquid adapts to the container. It flows into the container, and what the liquid is and the form that it takes is determined not by the attributes of the liquid, but by the attributes of the container that it's poured into. And so it seemed to me that the metaphor of the liquid gave a slightly different view as to what it might mean to learn something, that thing that you are learning, instead of being taken from the outside world and put into the world inside your head, there is a process of adaptation in that. And the other entailment, the other really interesting entailment of the liquid idea came from the parents who talked about learning as osmosis. And quite a few parents referred to this idea that learning was something that could happen by osmosis. So learning to read by virtual osmosis. He seems to have learnt by osmosis. And that sort of set up the idea that there can be a transference through this sort of semi-permeable membrane of osmosis. There can be a kind of a transference that's not under anybody's control or under anybody's volition. It's something that simply happens. And another entailment of that idea of liquid was parents who talked about coalescence, about the idea of, the third quote down that says that reading coalesces out of the mist, that kind of coming together that I had also sort of felt was being hinted at by that trajectory that just went from nowhere to being able to do it, the light bulb moment, where it seemed as if things had just coalesced together. They had just come together in a particular way at a particular point, rather than that kind of progressive building up journey like kind of metaphor. And the last quote at the end, where this parent is talking about things coalescing in the brain, but also in the idea of mystery, of mystery surrounding this. And I think when we're in that kind of the sort of the scenario that I started with, and we're in that sort of formal learning situation, it is very much about control, very much about control of this process and understanding this process. And I kept coming back to it through the reading research, you know, that when you're in a formal situation, you're not going to think very much of a school teacher who says, I don't know how children learn to read. You know, it's very much pinned to the idea that we understand what is happening here and we can control what is happening here. And those metaphors of building up and of journeys and of progress and of being on the way are very much metaphors that come from the idea that this is controllable. And some of the things when parents talked about osmosis, or when they talked about mysteries or coalescences in the brain, talking about things that are outside of control, things that aren't under either the control of somebody overseeing this process or even of the person who is undergoing whatever is happening here. But whatever is happening here is not something that's voluntary. And that again brought us up to the ideas of thinking about the natural and the cultural, because what parents were talking about, and in metaphors like the metaphor about osmosis, this is something that happens naturally. It's not controlled. Two things are put together in juxtaposition to each other, and this process, this interaction, takes place as a result of that. So it's natural. It's not being controlled. But obviously, when people say learning to read is natural, there's kind of an inherent contradiction in that, because reading is not natural. Reading is very clearly cultural and an attribute of our culture. But it seemed to bring together as well that kind of idea that for people to be part of their culture is a natural state for human beings. It's a natural state for human beings to, I don't even want to say learn their culture, but to be part of their culture. And if something that is, we portion off as part of our society as being reading is part of that culture, then it does become natural that people learn to read without volition, without control, without necessarily any understanding of that process and of what's happening in that process. So just to sort of sum up very briefly at the end, to think about some of the things that I feel that I've learned about learning through the research and through those considerations. First of all, I suppose that the big thing that I've learned is that there's a lot more to learn, that we don't know very much, that our understandings of learning are actually quite constrained, not least because almost all of our research about learning and almost all of our thinking about learning takes place in formal situations and formal setups rather than the informal ones, and the kind of learning that home educators talk about as being so powerful in their children's lives and in their own lives is something that gets pretty much short shrift in terms of educational thinking. So I think the first thing I think is that there's an awful lot more to go out and look at, and to use the metaphor, to explore. The other thing I think that I have learned is that our metaphors of understanding are incredibly powerful, and that if we want to understand learning differently, we have to think about how we're going to approach this abstract concept in different ways, and what happens if we play around with our understanding. What are the entailments of thinking about things like osmosis for learning, or for thinking about disrupting some of the metaphors that we so commonly use. I think another thing that's really important that comes out of all of this is that our scientific concepts of learning are not enough, because once you start unpacking them, and I did make a small allusion to the EYFS and the way in which the EYFS is based on metaphors about children's developmental milestones. Those are not literal things, those are metaphorical things. So even our supposedly scientific thinking about learning rests on these ideas. And so what we need, I suppose, to take on board from the study of metaphors is how powerfully these underlie our thinking, you know, as I say, including scientific thinking, and that if we want to expand our thinking about learning, we need to be addressing those as well as sort of the kind of more qualitative experiences that parents might bring to the table about all of this as well. And I suppose the other thing that struck me really powerfully about my own changes and my own thinking around this is how I came into the situation to look at the informal learning with ideas about, I ought to be able to find these things in this situation. And, you know, if I look hard enough, I will understand what happened to my daughter in her learning to read in terms of journeys, in terms of progress, and how confounding it was when I couldn't find those things that I expected to find when I looked at what had happened to her, and, you know, what had happened in our house over that period. What you're bringing to, what I was bringing to it then, was a metaphorical understanding, not a reflection of reality, not something that came from evidence, but something that came from my thinking and my growing up, my academically growing up in a world that rests on those kind of metaphors. So I'll leave it there, because I think we've got some questions in the chat, and it would be really nice to gather other people's thoughts about some of this.
Thank you, Harriet. Yeah.
I'm just trying to remove your, or add my own spotlight. Hang on. So that
Do you want me to stop the screen share? Shall I stop?
Yeah, if you could stop the screen share, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
There we go.
Brilliant. Thank you, Harriet. That was amazing. When you summed up at the end, there is always more to learn. I don't know how many people here know me, or how well you know me, but I've been working in education and have been fascinated with learning for over 25 years. Yeah. And I have never, ever looked at learning in terms of those metaphors before. And I was just blown away. It was so obvious. Like this week alone, I know I have texted somebody and said, wow, I have just been through the most amazing learning curve. And it was like, it's so, like, we use it all the time. It's like, it's just part of our everyday.
Yeah.
That was brilliant, and I completely share your reservations about the milestones in the EYFS. It's where I started early years. Was my thing so long ago that I had just started my teaching career just as they were introducing the EYFS, the early years foundation stage. So yeah, I completely share your reservations about that. I wonder if we did have one question, particularly from Tom. There aren't, or there are enough of us here that I think if Tom is there and he wants to unmute, he could actually ask his question himself. I'll just, yes, he is going to, there we go.
Sorry, hello. It wasn't really particularly important. I'm going through, well, us as a family are going through a similar thing where we're trying to just see, you know, not be too controlling of the process and just see how that osmosis can take place naturally. But obviously we've got family members who are doing the traditional school system and making us worry just about generally not doing it in the same way. And that graph was just hilarious, because I love that. I think Naomi Fisher uses a very similar picture of how learning happens, you know, just that kind of mess. But I think, you know, it's just encouraging when you hear stories like that, and it seems to be a different age every time for every family. I mean, did you find that there was a, you know, when parents did it like this in a messy way, was there a kind of an age that was roughly about the same, or was it always completely different?
One of the things that was really striking was this really wide window for children to learn to read in. So, you know, and I kept going back to, you know, if you're in formal education and you're not reading by the time you're 6, 7, you are in serious trouble. Home educating families, the youngest child, parents said she could read was 18 months. She recognized logos and they said that was reading and that's good enough for me. And the oldest child was 16. And that enormously wide window. And I think this is one of the really important things that there is to learn from home education, because that window, there were children, you know, like that boy there learning to read at 13. You know, in school, learning to read is absolutely crucial, and if you can't do it early on successfully, you lose out on everything else. The entire curriculum is based on literacy. Home education is not like that. You know, there are other ways for children to learn, other ways that they employ, the verbal, the visual, the hands-on, so that if they are not reading until they are older, it doesn't make any difference to the rest of their education. And the other thing that's, I think, that really underpins this idea of the age range at which children learn to read is what we found through the reading research was that the formal educational idea is that children learn to read. They start with these building blocks, phonics, and they start off reading, you know, very simple text. And then as they become more confident readers, they go off and they read more exciting books, and they're reading for information, and, you know, and they're reading Harry Potter or whatever it is, you know, or working their poor way up the Oxford reading tree. In home education, children, and it's back to that metaphor, that idea of washing in language. What we found was that children were prolifically read to, they listened to books, they talked to adults, they had all kinds of literary experiences before they became independent readers themselves, and they brought that knowledge to reading instead of the other way around, the kind of the school idea that you learn to read and then that reading enables you to gain that knowledge. These children, they had those experiences, they had those understandings, and they brought those to reading, so that when they did start reading, things could go incredibly fast because they already had great vocabularies, sophisticated grammar, had understandings of things like genre and narrative and dialogue, and, you know, which they had gained not through reading independently themselves, but through other things that had happened in their lives. So it's just quite a different trajectory. But I do think as well, Tom, one of the other things that parents said to us was that they felt that part of their role in their children learning to read was protecting them from a culture that sees early reading as being so educationally make or break. You know, and right. The anxiety that there is in, you know, in the wider family. And I mean, our son didn't learn to read until he was 9, and I was doing all the research, and there were still days when I felt absolutely terrible about it, and, you know, what am I going to do? You know, you know, here I am, I'm a home education researcher, and I've got this boy who can't read, and, you know, there were days when I just felt really terrible about it. And then of course he learned, and it was, you know, and it was just, yeah, and, you know, and a year later, by the time he was 10, you wouldn't say, you know, there was no way that you could be saying, oh, you didn't learn to read until really, really late, did you? There was no difference.
Sure.
I think, Harriet, that brings us also to Aja's question, which ties in. He says, well, what's an alternative to EYFS phonics? Is it best to wait until they're slightly older?
My line on all of this is, I think you know best what's right for your child and what's right for you. And I would never advocate to anybody who felt really uncomfortable about it, you know, don't teach a child to read, you know, just wait and let it happen. Or to somebody who wanted to just wait and see how things unfolded, say, no, you need to get started on something. I think it depends on the child. And one of the things that came out of our research very powerfully was that children who didn't want to be taught phonics or taught this or taught that or even read to made it very clear to their parents, and, you know, that was the end of the matter. And there was one boy, and he said he actually told his mum, said, I'm not doing this, you know, don't waste your time, I'm not doing it. And I think as parents, we're in that position and we know that our children aren't interested, we're not going to force it on them. So I think if your child doesn't want to do it, they'll make it plain to you. But if your comfort zone where you feel right about your home education is to say, right, we're going to do whatever it is, 20 minutes of reading a day, that's what you do, because it's about finding what's right for you, what's right for your family, what's right for your child.
Lovely. I definitely had one that refused. Like, in fact, he's 13 now, and we've never read a book to him. Yeah. Right from the offset. We sort of tried that all. It's really important to read to them every day. And he was a definite, I'm not having that. Yeah. And he can read. Yeah. You know, he learned in another way. Without trying to use too many metaphors, he found his own way to do it. And he was about 11 and a half when we knew that that was something that he had achieved. It's Juliet says, in my experience, it's always counterproductive to force it if you meet with resistance from a child. So we've got a few minutes left, so if anyone wanted to ask any more questions in the chat, would actually, or unmute.
Can I ask Harriet just to mention her book?
Yes, do that, Harriet.
Yes. It just so happens, yes. So I did, this is Rethinking Learning to Read, which I did write, particularly aimed at home educating parents, to try and share some of the ideas about the reading, because I do think that the reading research, one of the things about the reading research, everybody has got a story about reading. You know, everybody's story was a little bit different. Everybody's story was really fascinating. And I think for home educators, it's a real resource for us to be able to go. And I know when you know, with our children, it was, I always felt it really reassuring to talk to other home educators, learn about their experiences, to hear about children, you know, who had done things differently, and you know, and now were fine and were making their way in the world. And so I think it's really good to be sharing those. Yes, or there is my PhD thesis, which you can read for free if you just put my name and Rethinking Learning to Read into Google. And
Tom says he loved your thesis. Though.
That's what I was going to say. I wonder if you've read that. You can read the comment that says he loved your thesis. I wonder if, Juliet, you mind if I mention that during the lunch hour, I don't really know what the schedule is, lunchtime, there is a table, like in the lounge area on the website. There's a lounge area with several different tables where you can spend your lunchtime, and each table has a different topic of conversation, and one of them, which happens to be the one I'm hosting, is about learning to read. So you can come and sort of share your experiences, listen to other people's experiences about children learning to read. Like all that, you know, like you say, Harriet, everyone's got a story, and if we can share those with each other as a way of sort of encouraging and supporting each other in what is actually a very different way from what we're really familiar with, and you know, what largely is the way that it's sort of mainstream and other people and families are going through, then you'd be very welcome to join us there. So you can get there via the lounge area on the website, and I think it's 12:45.
Yeah, 12:45 to 1:45, and it's today and Monday and Tuesday.
Yes, it is.
And the top menu of the conference also has, of the website, has the lounge link on there, and the lobby has a link on there.
So unfortunately, I won't be able to make that today, but if anybody wants to email me, I'm always really, really happy to hear from people. If you want to email me and ask any questions, or
do you want to pop that email in the chat, Harriet?
It's on that. Yeah, I can do. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got lots of stories coming in. You know, where some Olive says her son learned to read almost overnight. It's a bit like potty training. If you wait till the right time, it can go well. You know, it goes easier the more you kind of follow the child's lead, and you know, I think it's a bit of that. Ruth says one of her sons learned to read on the back of his older siblings. She doesn't remember teaching him. I had a similar situation with a younger child learning while I was working with the older child. The youngest only reading chapter books now, age 13. But her daughter was reading Shakespeare and Dickens at age 10. And this is something that's, you know, the interesting thing is when they are a few years older, you won't actually know the difference.
Yes.
So it is a case of, you know, why do you need to rush it? If you're home educating, why do you need to rush it? In school, I can understand that your child will actually have issues if they can't read earlier. But generally with home education, we can really tap into that natural desire to learn. Allison's got a story there. She said, I'd won at almost 9 with Pokemon on the Game Boy. And Harriet interviewed Allison just as he cracked the code. So they would have been fresh in your mind. Yeah.
Alice is asking, she just says she's been trying to buy your book, but it seems to be sold out, which is great. But can you suggest where she might be able to get it from? Is that something you can do?
It should be still available through Educational Heretics. but I haven't had any communication with Mike for a while.
Yeah,
So
they
I
need to
have.
restock on Amazon or something.
yeah, I can have
Harriet,
that.
Harriet, I have. I know.
Oh, you have.
I know.
Yeah.
It's out of print, but you can buy it on Kindle at the moment. And what
Okay.
we're trying to do is we're trying to produce a version of it that's print on demand. Okay, so I've just had all the books from the distributor, and there are none of yours left. You sold out.
Right.
How many did you have printed? It's time to print.
I don't know. I don't know. It wasn't my job.
Are there second-hand ones in circulation? I haven't got any more myself. I used to have a stash here, and I don't have any more myself.
Yeah, that would be looking at second-hand options.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Maybe I need to have a chat with Mike and see, or chat with you, Alison, and see what we can do.
Yeah, you didn't know you were that
No,
prolific and
No, I didn't know.
appreciated. Yeah, we've all, the thing is that kind of work stands at the test of time. That doesn't change. People don't change in that way, and our learning doesn't change. So any last questions? We can have about 5 more minutes.
Lucy has put a question in the chat, but I wonder if Lucy's available to unmute and ask the question. Oh no, that wasn't Lucy. I'm going to take the camera on. Excellent.
Was it me?
Hello, Lucy. Yes.
It was in regards to my 1-year-old. Is that the one?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So obviously they can't read, but I'm teaching my son who's 6 to read, and he's getting there. He's getting better, definitely. But just my 1-year-old, as she's getting older, how would I go about it? I know there's flashcards and things you can use, but any tips to, help her along the way?
I would just have an experiment around, just see what she's interested in, or see what you've got to hand, and just play some games and just see what suits you. I mean, we had all sorts, parents sort of instigating things, children making up games, working things out together, and lots of really inventive things and I would just do it like that. And I think one of the really important things was that parents said over and over again, we want them to love reading, we want them to love stories, we want them to love reading. And it was that idea of, here's this really great thing that we can do together, rather than here's this thing that you have to learn. And so I would say, and obviously talking and reading. If you've got a child who enjoys being read to, lots of parents said, they were just raised on stories. We just read all the time. We read to them all the time. And that kind of idea of washing in language. But I would personally say very much the emphasis on what you're enjoying and what the children are enjoying, and the most fun that you can get out of it, which sometimes means not doing anything, because there is no rush. Because we grow up in a culture where it is very, very rushed. But actually, I think home education shows that that's a false rush. It doesn't need to be approached like that. And
I think actually this time round, my 2 siblings living at home, and they're quite young, so she'll probably copy her brother anyway. But my eldest daughter, who's almost 20, she didn't have any younger siblings. She was just the only child for many, many years, so she struggled with reading, and still now she doesn't know much grammar. She doesn't know how to write her 2's in the right place, there and there. She's really struggling. And I don't know, I wish I homeschooled her, but I never did. She just went to school.
Yeah.
She struggled in school. So I wish I could turn back time and homeschooled her. But definitely this time round, I'm going to make sure that there's no issues really with the reading. So yeah.
Have lots of fun and do what everybody enjoys.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
And relax, which is probably the hardest thing of all to do.
Yeah, you do worry, don't you? You do, oh no, I'm not doing enough. But yeah. Relax.
Yeah. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you. I wonder if I might just round up by reading some of the comments for the purpose of the recording, because I'm assuming the chats don't come out on the recording. So Olive has said, when I learned about the neuroscience of the word form area, I'm not entirely sure I maybe that's something you understand, Harriet. She says, I realised that he had suddenly moved to visualising words, and he is now a professor. So talking about the journey of reading and how reading late, or how, see, I've talked about that journey again, Harriet, you can't get away from it, can you? The journey of reading, and sort of talking about different ways that people acquire the skill of reading, and now it is a professor, so it doesn't appear to have hindered future outcomes in any way by home educating and allowing reading to be learnt when they are ready. Alice says, I would suggest, oh no, that's a self-promotion thing. Thank you, Alice. I would suggest joining Heidi Steele's webinars, that's me, and courses to get comfy with the idea of natural process. Thank you, Alice. And then Alison has said, my youngest loved being read to, and at one point we were borrowing almost 50 picture books a week at the library. Wow. She learnt to read at 4.5 with 0 input other than being read to.
I mean, I said something, sorry, Heidi, yes, about modeling. So if you're modeling a love of reading and just reading to them, that is actually already such a fantastic gateway, and you will pick up very quickly when they are ready. But sometimes they just love being read to for a very long time. But you're modeling that love of books. So you're not making it a chore and a task and hard work that they can resist. It's just like something wonderful that they want. They become keen to enter that world and to understand and to make sense of the scribbles in front of them. So to me, that modeling is incredibly important, just reading with them.
So I think one of the most telling
the vocabulary.
I think one of the most telling things for me about reading aloud was how many families carried on doing it after their children were reading independently. That it wasn't that the reading aloud was just something that they loved to do together and that they got a lot of family pleasure out of, rather than an instrumentalized, we're reading to you so that you do, learn to read yourself. And when you can do it, the purpose is gone from this thing.
Yeah.
It was really great to hear how many families just carried on doing that because they just enjoyed it so much.
Yeah. Heidi, do you want to wrap up or shall I?
Yes, you wrap up, my love.
Thank you. Okay, so Harriet, thank you so much. I can't spotlight myself, Heidi, so you can find. Okay, Harriet, thank you. I always enjoy our conversations, and I know that this is a talk you could give again and again, and there would always be more people who would want to hear what you've got to say, because it is incredibly empowering to us as parents to know that actually, that it's not a big secret. It is kind of a mystery how they learn, but there are tools to actually help for us as parents to kind of give to understand how our children's brains work and how we can actually kind of facilitate with them. And as I said, it's a bit like potty training. It's always best if you work with the child rather than against them. And I just want to thank you for your time this morning, and I hope we will see you around on the site. The communication's a bit different this year to when we used Hoover, but there are ways and means to speak to each other. So hopefully we'll hear more from you. Thank you very much, everybody. And for those of you who want, don't forget the lunch tables.
Good to see everybody, and hope to hear from some of you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me, Juliet.
Bye.
Bye.